He saw everything, but he won't say a word. 10-year-old Evan Carter was just getting a glass of water when he witnessed a brutal murder right outside his window. His heart pounded as he locked eyes with the killer, a respected man in town, someone everyone trusted. But from that moment on, Evan refused to speak. Not to his mother, not to the police, not to anyone. Now, with the court date closing in and the real killer growing desperate, his silence could get him killed. Will Evan break before it's too late? Or will his shocking courtroom confession expose the truth in front of everyone? Before we start, buckle up, get ready, and subscribe for a special surprise dropping tomorrow. The night was silent, except for the soft hum of crickets outside 10-year-old Evan Carter's window. The glow of his nightlight barely illuminated the room, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. He lay in bed, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wasn't coming tonight. His throat was dry, and he knew he wouldn't be able to rest until he got a drink of water. Slipping out of bed, he tiptoed across the wooden floor, careful not to wake his mother in the next room. The house felt eerie at this hour, the ticking clock in the hallway louder than usual. As he passed the living room, he instinctively glanced toward the window, his small fingers gripping the edge of the wall. Then he saw it. A man stood in the alley behind their house, his face partially hidden under the dim glow of a street lamp. Another figure stood in front of him, shaking, hands raised in surrender. Evan's breath hitched. Something about the way the second man's body trembled made his stomach twist. Then, without warning, the flash of a knife caught the light. A sharp movement, a muffled gasp. The man staggered backward, clutching his stomach, dark liquid spreading across his shirt. He collapsed onto the pavement. Evan's entire body went rigid, his tiny hands shaking against the window pane. The killer took a step back, breathing heavily. Then, as if sensing he was being watched, his head snapped up. Evan froze. For a split second, their eyes locked. Even in the dim light, Evan recognized him. Everyone in town knew him, respected him, trusted him. The man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Evan's heart pounded so hard it felt like it would break through his ribs. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there paralyzed in fear. The killer moved, sliding the bloodied knife into his pocket. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He simply straightened his coat and walked off into the darkness as if nothing had happened. Evan stumbled back from the window, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His legs wobbled as he gripped the edge of the couch for balance. His mind screamed at him to tell someone, to wake his mother, to call the police, but his throat felt like it was closing up. The image of the man's eyes staring directly into his burned in his mind. He knew who Evan was. Tears welled up, but he swallowed them down. If he spoke, if he told anyone what he saw, the man would know. He would come back. Evan pressed his back against the wall, hands clenched into fists. His whole body trembling, he had to stay silent. It was the only way to stay alive. The flashing red and blue lights painted the walls of Evan Carter's living room in shifting colors. His mother, Julia, sat beside him on the couch, gripping his hand so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Officers moved around them, speaking in hushed tones, their radios crackling with updates. Detective Sarah Lawson knelt in front of Evan, her hazel eyes soft but searching. She had been on the force for over 15 years and had seen plenty of cases, but something about this boy's silence unsettled her. His small frame was stiff, his gaze unfocused, staring at a spot on the floor as if he could still see the scene he had witnessed outside his window. "Evan," she said gently, her voice barely above a whisper, "can you tell me what you saw?" Nothing. The boy didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't react at all. Julia let out a shaky breath, brushing her fingers through Evan's dark brown hair. "Baby, please," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Whatever you saw, you can tell them. They just want to help." Still, Evan said nothing. Lawson studied him for a long moment, taking in the subtle tremble of his fingers, the way his lips were slightly parted like he wanted to speak but couldn't force the words out. She had seen this kind of reaction before. Victims who had been too close to a crime, too afraid to speak because the horror of it was still clinging to them. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small notepad, flipping it open. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," she said, keeping her tone light. "But maybe you can write it down, anything you remember." She set the notepad on the coffee table in front of him, sliding it toward him. His eyes flickered to the notepad for only a second before dropping back to the floor. Lawson sighed, glancing at Julia, who looked on the verge of breaking down. Another officer entered the room, his voice low as he addressed Lawson. "The Vic's been identified. Devin Marquez, known dealer. We're looking into possible gang ties." Lawson's jaw tightened. "Witnesses?" "None so far," the officer replied. "Except maybe him." He nodded toward Evan. Lawson's gaze returned to the boy, her instincts telling her that whatever he had seen, it wasn't just some random street killing. His silence wasn't just from shock, it was fear. She leaned forward slightly. "Evan, I know this is scary, but if you saw something, we need to know. Whoever did this, they can't hurt you now." For the first time, Evan reacted. His fingers curled into fists on his lap, his shoulders rising with a deep, shuddering breath. And then, slowly, he turned his head and looked Lawson dead in the eyes. It was only for a second, but in that second, Lawson knew he had seen the killer, and he was absolutely terrified. The town of Brookside was small, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name. People prided themselves on their sense of community, their trust in one another. That's why when the news of the murder spread, the entire town buzzed with speculation. A drug dealer killed in their quiet neighborhood? It didn't make sense. Rumors flew about gang activity creeping in from the city, about violence spilling into their safe streets. But no one suspected the truth. No one suspected him. Evan sat at the kitchen table, his breakfast untouched. His mother hovered over the stove, but she hadn't really been cooking. Every few minutes, she would turn, glancing at him with worried eyes before sighing and returning to stirring a pot that had long since gone cold. "You didn't sleep last night," she said softly, not looking at him. Evan didn't respond. His fingers played with the hem of his hoodie, twisting the fabric, knotting it between his fingers. "I called the school," Julia continued, forcing a smile. "Told them you'd be out for a few days, just until things settle down." Still, nothing. She sat across from him, reaching for his hands, but he flinched away. Her face fell. She had never seen him like this before. Her son, who used to chatter about dinosaurs and superheroes, who would excitedly tell her every little detail about his day, now sat silent, withdrawn. A knock at the door made them both jump. Julia stood quickly, shaking off her nerves before opening it. A warm, familiar voice greeted her. "Mrs. Carter." Evan stiffened. "Coach Reynolds," Julia said, surprised. "This is unexpected." The tall man stepped inside, flashing his usual kind smile. "Just wanted to check in," he said. "The news about the murder is all over town, and when I heard Evan might have been nearby, well," his gaze drifted past her, landing on Evan at the table. "I wanted to make sure he was okay." Evan's chest tightened. He watched as his Little League coach moved closer, his every step calculated, smooth. The same man who had given him pep talks after games, who had patted his shoulder when he struck out, who had promised him that hard work always paid off. Now, standing in his kitchen, he looked different. Or maybe Evan was just seeing him for who he really was. "You doing okay, buddy?" Reynolds asked, crouching slightly to meet his eyes. Evan's hands clenched under the table. He could feel the weight of the man's stare, the unspoken warning. Beneath his words, "Say nothing." His throat felt dry, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. He forced himself to nod. Reynolds smiled, resting a hand on Evan's shoulder. It was light, casual, but to Evan, it felt like a steel grip. "That's good," Reynolds said. "You're a strong kid." The message was clear. Evan knew exactly what would happen if he ever opened his mouth. The house felt different that night. The walls seemed thinner, the air heavier. Every creak of the floorboards made Evan's skin prickle. He hadn't spoken a word all day, not even when his mother begged him to eat. His body felt like it was on autopilot, but his mind was screaming, running through the same moment over and over again. Coach Reynolds' hand on his shoulder, his voice, his warning. Evan lay in bed, curled beneath the covers, his eyes fixed. On the door, his mother had left the hallway light on, just like she always did. It was supposed to make him feel safe. It didn't. He wanted to sleep, but his body wouldn't relax. His fingers dug into the sheets as he listened. The house was quiet. His mother had gone to bed hours ago. Then he heard it. A noise. Soft. Subtle. But there, his breath hitched. Someone was downstairs. Evan's heart pounded in his ears as he slid out of bed. He moved slowly, careful not to make a sound. Peeking out of his room, he looked toward his mother's door. It was closed. She hadn't heard anything. Another sound. He crept down the hallway, his bare feet silent against the floor. At the top of the stairs, he crouched low, peering into the darkness below. The front door was shut, the windows locked, but something was off. He could feel it. The stillness was too perfect. A shadow moved. Evan's pulse skyrocketed. He ducked back, pressing himself against the wall, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. Someone was in the house. He squeezed his eyes shut. It's him. He came back. Evan didn't move, didn't breathe. He listened. The sound of slow, deliberate movement, not searching for valuables, looking for something, looking for him. A floorboard creaked near the stairs. Evan's fingers curled into fists. His whole body was trembling, but he forced himself to think. If he ran now, he'd make noise. If he stayed put, he was trapped. What do I do? What do I do? Then another noise, this time from outside. A car engine, headlights passing, the movement. Downstairs stopped. Silence. Then, after what felt like forever, another soft sound, a door closing. Evan waited. 5 minutes. 10. He didn't move, barely even blinked. Then finally he forced himself to peek down the stairs again. Empty. The house was still. Whoever had been there was gone. Evan's hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the railing as he descended, his knees wobbly beneath him. He checked the front door. Locked. The windows. Locked. But he knew someone had been inside, and they hadn't taken anything. They hadn't come to steal. They had come to send a message. Evan sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of untouched hot chocolate. His mother paced across the room, her voice shaking as she spoke into the phone. I don't know how they got in, Julia said, glancing at the locked windows for the 10th time. Nothing was taken, but she turned, looking at Evan. He's scared, Detective. He hasn't slept. He won't even talk to me. Detective Lawson's voice crackled softly on the other end, calm but serious. Julia nodded as she listened, biting her lip. Okay, I'll bring him in. She hung up and knelt beside Evan, gently taking his hand. Sweetheart, we're going to the police station. Detective Lawson wants to talk to us. She thinks she can help. Evan stared at the table. His chest was tight, his stomach twisted in knots. He didn't want to go. He didn't want to be anywhere but in his bed, buried under blankets, pretending none of this was happening. But he knew that wasn't an option anymore. The ride to the station was quiet. Julia kept glancing at him, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. When they arrived, Detective Lawson met them in the lobby. Hey, Evan, she greeted, crouching to his level. It's good to see you again. Evan didn't respond. He just lowered his gaze, his fingers curling into the hem of his hoodie. Lawson sighed, standing up and motioning for them to follow her into a small office. The walls were lined with case files. A coffee cup sat half empty on the desk. She gestured for them to sit before leaning against the desk, arms crossed. I want to be very honest with you, Julia, she said, her expression serious. A break-in with nothing stolen. That's not random. Julia's face paled. You think it's connected to the murder? I do, Lawson admitted. Her eyes flickered toward Evan, who was still staring at his lap, silent. And I think Evan knows something. Julia turned to her son, desperation in her voice. Evan, please, if you saw something, anything, you have to tell us. Evan clenched his jaw. His mother didn't understand. If he spoke, he would be... Next, Lawson crouched down in front of him again, her voice softer now. Evan, I know you're scared, but whatever you're holding in, it's hurting you. And if someone is trying to silence you, that means what you know is important. His fingers dug into his hoodie. His throat burned with the words he wanted to say, but couldn't. Lawson reached into her pocket and pulled out a small notepad. "You don't have to say it," she said, setting the pen on the table. "Just write it down." Evan stared at the blank page. His hand hovered over the pen, but then he pushed it away. His message was clear. He wasn't talking. Not now. Not ever. The school parking lot was nearly empty when Julia pulled up to pick Evan up from his first day back. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. Evan sat on the curb, his backpack resting beside him, shoulders slumped. He hadn't spoken a word all day, not to his teachers, not to his classmates, and certainly not to his mother. Julia let out a quiet sigh as she parked the car. She wanted to believe this nightmare would end soon, that Evan would wake up one morning and be himself again, that the fear in his eyes would disappear, but it hadn't. If anything, it was worse. She got out of the car, forcing a smile. "Hey, sweetheart," grabbing his bag and slipping into the passenger seat. The silence between them stretched as she pulled out of the lot. A few blocks from home, Julia felt her phone buzz in the cup holder. Glancing down, she saw unknown. Caller flash across the screen. Frowning, she answered. "Hello?" At first, nothing. Then, a deep, distorted voice. "Keep the boy quiet." Her breath caught in her throat. "Who is this?" The call disconnected. Her fingers tightened around the wheel. A cold chill ran down her spine. She stole a quick glance at Evan, but he was staring out the window, oblivious. When she pulled into the driveway, she locked the doors before turning. To him, "Evan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." His small hands gripped his backpack. "Has someone threatened you?" she asked, voice shaking. "Is that why you won't talk?" Evan's body tensed. He didn't answer, but the flicker of fear in his eyes told her everything. She swallowed hard. "Evan, no one is going to hurt you, I promise." A lie, one she desperately wanted to believe. Before she could say anything else, a loud bang echoed. From outside, Julia jolted, whipping around. The mailbox had been knocked over, smashed. A dark SUV sped away down the street, its taillights disappearing into the distance. Her stomach dropped. Evan had gone pale, his breathing quick and shallow. Julia clenched her fists. Enough was enough. She pulled out her phone and dialed Detective Lawson. The second she answered, Julia's voice was firm, determined. "Someone just threatened us. I don't care what it takes, Sarah. We're coming in, and Evan is talking." Evan's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide. He shook his head violently, his hands trembling. Julia grabbed his hands, squeezing them gently. "Sweetheart, I know you're scared," she whispered, "but we can't live like this. They won't stop." Tears welled in his eyes. He shook his head again. Julia pulled him close, holding him tight. "They won't stop, Evan," she repeated, "unless you do." Evan sat stiffly in the courthouse waiting room, his hands curled into fists in his lap. His mother sat beside him, her fingers gripping his knee as if afraid he might disappear. Across from them, Detective Lawson leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, studying him closely. "Evan," she said softly, "this is it. You're about to go in." He stared at the floor, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear her. "You don't have to be afraid," Lawson continued. "No one can hurt you here. The judge, the officers, everyone in that room is here to protect you." Evan swallowed hard. That wasn't true. Not really, because he would be in that room too. Coach Reynolds, the man who had stared at him across the kitchen like he could see into his soul. The man who had rested his hand on his shoulder, squeezing just enough to send a warning. The man who had sent someone into their home. Someone who left no trace, but made sure Evan knew exactly what they were capable of. His stomach churned. A bailiff stepped into the waiting room. "We're ready." Julia squeezed Evan's hand. "I love you," she whispered, "no matter what happens in there." Evan didn't respond. He wasn't sure he could. As he followed the bailiff through the heavy double doors, the courtroom stretched out before him. It was bigger than he expected, more intimidating. Rows of people sat in the gallery, whispering, shifting in their seats, and then he saw him. Coach Reynolds sat calmly at the defendant's table, dressed in a crisp navy suit, hands folded neatly on the desk. He looked exactly like he always did, polished, respected, in control. But when Evan entered, Reynolds slowly lifted his gaze and locked eyes with him. A chill ran down Evan's spine. He wanted to run. Instead, he was led to the witness stand. His legs felt shaky as he climbed onto the seat, the microphone looming in front of him. The judge, an older man with tired eyes, peered down at him. "Please state your name for the court." Evan's throat tightened. His fingers gripped the edge of the wooden stand so hard his knuckles turned white. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The courtroom was silent. Julia shifted in her seat, her hands clasped together like she was praying. Detective Lawson sat up straighter, her gaze locked onto him. "Evan," the judge prompted gently. His breath came out ragged. His eyes darted to Reynolds. The man was still watching him, still waiting. "Say nothing," the words burned in his chest. He couldn't do this, but then he thought of the night at the window, the blood, the knife, the look on that man's face as he walked away like nothing had happened. Evan closed his eyes, and then, finally, he spoke. My name is in a whisper, barely audible over the silence of the courtroom. His hands were clenched into fists, his breathing shallow, his entire body tense. He had spoken. The weight of those 3 simple words settled heavily on his chest, and he knew there was no turning back now. The prosecutor, a tall woman with sharp eyes, stepped forward. "Evan," she said gently, "I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell us what happened the night of the murder." Evan swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. His gaze flickered towards Coach Reynolds. The man sat perfectly still, his face unreadable, his posture relaxed. He didn't look nervous, he didn't look angry. He just watched. Evan's stomach twisted. "Evan," the prosecutor repeated, "can you tell us what you saw?" His fingers dug into the wooden stand. He forced himself to take a deep breath, but his chest felt tight. The words were trapped. He could feel them clawing at his throat, begging to be let out. Reynolds shifted slightly in his seat. It was barely noticeable, but to Evan, it was a warning. He's watching. He's always watching. The prosecutor waited, giving him space, but the silence dragged on too long. The defense attorney stood abruptly. "Your Honor, if the witness is unable to testify, I move to dismiss." "I saw him," Evan blurted out. The words sliced through the tension in the room like a blade. A murmur spread through the gallery. Julia gasped softly from the front, Rao covering her mouth with her hands. Detective Lawson leaned forward, her eyes locked on Evan. The prosecutor turned back to him. "Who, Evan? Who did you see?" Evan hesitated. Reynolds still wasn't reacting. No anger, no denial, just patient silence. Evan's heart pounded so hard it hurt. He thought of the break-in, the phone call, the smashed mailbox, the unspoken threats, but he also thought of the man in the alley. The blood, the fear, the truth sat at the edge of his tongue, trembling, waiting to escape. Then, somehow, he found his voice. "It was him," Evan said, his voice shaking but firm. "Coach Reynolds." The room exploded. Gasps, whispers, a gavel banging. Julia let out a choked sob. Lawson exhaled sharply, relief flashing across her face. But Evan wasn't looking at any of them. He was looking at Reynolds. The man finally reacted. His fingers curled into a fist, his jaw tightening just enough for Evan to notice. For the first time, there was something else in his expression, something dangerous, but it was too late. The words were out, and nothing could stop the truth now. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Voices clashed, overlapping, some in shock, others in disbelief. The judge pounded his gavel, demanding order, but the murmurs didn't stop. The weight of Evan's words hung in the air, irreversible, unshakable. Julia gasped, pressing her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with fear and relief all at once. Detective Lawson sat still, her expression unreadable, but the fire in her eyes told Evan that she had known, she had suspected, and now the truth was out. But Coach Reynolds didn't flinch. He didn't lunge across the courtroom. He didn't shout in protest. He simply sat there, his fingers laced together, his expression perfectly controlled, too controlled. He didn't even look at Evan, as if he had already calculated his next move. The defense attorney stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor." His voice was sharp, urgent. "This is a scared child being manipulated." "He's not lying," Lawson said, standing. The judge turned toward her with a frown. "Detective Lawson, I have evidence," she continued, ignoring the murmurs that followed. "Evans' testimony corroborates findings from our ongoing investigation." Reynolds finally moved, adjusting his cuffs, still silent. The judge looked to the prosecutor. "Proceed carefully," he warned. The prosecutor nodded and turned back to Evan. Her voice measured. "Evan, are you absolutely sure?" Evan's heart was hammering against his ribs, his palms slick with sweat, but he didn't look away from Reynolds. "Yes," he said. "I saw him." A ripple of energy coursed through the courtroom. The prosecutor walked slowly toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a witness, a child who has been terrified into silence for weeks. But now, despite the fear, despite the threats, he's telling the truth." She turned back to Evan. "Can you tell us exactly what you saw?" Evan swallowed hard. His hands trembled, but he forced himself to remember. "He was in the alley," he said, his voice gaining strength. "There was another man there. He was scared. He was begging." Evan paused, the image of the night flashing in his mind. The blood, the knife. "Coach Reynolds pulled out a knife," Evan continued. "He stabbed him." Another wave of gasps. Evan forced himself to go on. "He looked up at my window. He saw me, but he didn't run. He just walked away." Silence. Reynolds finally spoke. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice smooth, calm. "The boy is traumatized." "I'm not confused," he said louder now. "You killed that man." For the first time, something flickered in Reynolds' eyes, a tiny, fleeting crack in his perfect mask. And Evan knew he had him. The courtroom was deathly silent, every eye locked on Evan. The weight of his words had shifted the atmosphere entirely. What had started as a case with shaky evidence was now something far more dangerous. The accusation against Coach Reynolds had sent shockwaves through the room. Reynolds sat still, his fingers pressed together, his lips slightly pursed, as if considering his next move. Then finally he let out a low chuckle. It was soft, controlled, calculated, the imagination of a child. He muttered, shaking his head. "It's a shame, really." But Detective Lawson was already on her feet. "Your Honor, if I may," she said, holding up a thick folder, "this case has been ongoing, and in light of Evan Carter's testimony, I'd like to present additional evidence to the court." Reynolds' face twitched. The judge gave a firm nod. "Proceed." Lawson moved toward the prosecution, flipping open the folder. "We re-examined security footage from a convenience store near the crime scene," she said. "The defendant's vehicle was spotted in the area exactly during the estimated time of the murder." The prosecutor lifted a photo from the folder. It was grainy, but unmistakable. A dark SUV, parked in the shadows near the alley. Lawson continued. "Additionally, we pulled GPS data from the defendant's phone." She turned toward Reynolds, eyes sharp. "You told officers you were home all night, but records show you were within 2 blocks of the crime scene." A murmur spread through the courtroom. For the first time, Reynolds looked less sure of himself. The prosecutor stepped forward. "The victim, Devin Marquez, was known to have ties to drug distribution in this area. Our evidence suggests that this wasn't just a random act of violence. This was a deal gone bad." Reynolds' lawyer immediately stood. "Objection. This is all circumstantial." The prosecutor cut him off. "We also recovered forensic evidence from the crime scene, traces of fabric fibers from the exact type of coat Coach Reynolds wears." Reynolds clenched his jaw. "And the final piece of evidence," Lawson said, setting a small plastic bag on the prosecution's table. "The murder weapon, a switchblade, found discarded near a creek. We ran tests. The handle, covered in Reynolds' fingerprints." The courtroom exploded. Reynolds' mask shattered. His face paled, his jaw tightening as his lawyer whispered frantically in his ear. Evan gripped the edge of the witness stand, his heart racing. It was happening. The nightmare was unraveling, and the truth was winning. The judge banged his gavel. "Order!" He turned toward the defense. "Would the defendant like to respond?" Reynolds' lawyer shook his head, looking defeated. The judge's voice was firm. "Then, in light of this testimony and overwhelming evidence, the court moves forward with formal charges." The bailiff approached Reynolds, reaching for his wrist. "Coach Reynolds," the judge announced, "you are under arrest for the murder of Devin Marquez." As the bailiff snapped the cuffs around Coach Reynolds' wrists, the once composed man finally cracked. His jaw was clenched, his breathing heavy, but it wasn't fear that flashed in his eyes. It was fury. He turned his head slightly, just enough for Evan to see it. That look, the same one he had given him in the kitchen that night. Even now, in front of the judge, the jury, and a room full of people, he was warning him. Evan's stomach twisted, his fingers gripping the wooden edge of the witness stand. He had done what he was supposed to do. He told the truth. So why did it still feel like he wasn't safe? Julia rushed to him the moment the judge dismissed the court. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him so tightly he could barely breathe. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered against his hair. So proud." Evan exhaled shakily, resting his head against her shoulder. He wanted to believe it was over, that this was the end. But as he glanced toward the front of the courtroom, he saw Detective Lawson watching him. She approached, her expression unreadable. "You did good, kid," Evan swallowed, looking down. "It's over now, right?" Lawson hesitated, just for a second. "For Reynolds? Yeah. He's done, but I won't lie to you, Evan, he wasn't working alone." The words sent a chill down his spine. "There's still more to uncover," Lawson continued. "We know Reynolds was involved in something bigger, something tied to the drugs coming into town, but thanks to you, we just cut off their biggest player." Evan nodded, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. She crouched slightly so they were eye level. "Listen to me. You're safe now. I won't let anything happen to you." For the first time in weeks, her voice soft. "We're leaving town for a while. My sister's place, just until things settle down." He didn't argue. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded. As they left the courtroom, walking past reporters and flashing cameras, Evan felt lighter. His chest wasn't as tight. His hands weren't as clammy. He had spent so long running from his voice, afraid that speaking the truth would destroy him. But now, as the doors shut behind them, he realized something. His voice had saved him. He turned one last time, looking back at the place where he had finally spoken, the place where the truth had won. The drive out of town was quiet. The hum of the tires against the road was the only sound filling the car. Evan sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, watching as the streets he had known his whole life slowly disappeared behind him. Houses blurred into open fields. The town that had once felt safe was now just a distant memory. Julia gripped the wheel, her knuckles pale. She had barely spoken since they left. Her eyes flickered to the rearview mirror every few minutes, scanning the road behind them, as if expecting someone to be following. But no one was. They were finally free. Evan let out a slow breath and leaned back in his seat. His body still felt tense, like he was waiting for something bad to happen, but for the first time in weeks, he wasn't afraid. He had done what needed to be done. The courtroom, the trial, the arrest, it was over. Still, the feeling lingered, the weight of everything he had been through, the things he had seen, the things he had almost let destroy him. His mother glanced at him. "You okay, sweetheart?" He nodded slowly, still staring out the window. "Yeah," he whispered. And for the first time, he meant it. They drove for miles, past small towns and endless stretches of trees, until Julia finally pulled into a gas station. She exhaled, rubbing her temples before turning to Evan. "Do you want anything? A snack?" Evan thought about it for a second, then shook his head. "I'm okay." Julia gave him a soft smile. "I'll be quick." She stepped out of the car and disappeared inside. Evan sat still, watching the parking lot. A few cars were parked nearby, people coming and going, minding their own business. Everything was normal, ordinary, safe. He should have felt relief, but something still pulled at his thoughts. The silence, not his own, his mother's. She had fought so hard to protect him, had been strong for him, but he had seen the way her hands trembled on the wheel, the way she flinched at every unexpected sound. She had been scared too. Evan looked toward the store window, watching as she stood in line at the register, her expression weary, distant. She had been carrying this weight alone. He swallowed hard. His heart beat fast, not from fear, but from the realization that he had a voice now. And maybe it wasn't just for himself. When Julia returned to the car, Evan looked at her, really looked at her. He took a deep breath, then spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Thank you." She paused, blinking in surprise. For what? For believing me, for keeping me safe. Julia's face softened. She reached out, brushing a hand through his hair like she had when he was little. Always, baby. Evan smiled, a real one. He wasn't the same kid he had been before all of this. But he was still here, and that was enough.